The Lunar Alibi, written and read by the author, James Cawley. Lunar Descent Orbit, July 20th, 1969. 30,000 feet above the surface. If this was a movie, the director would have called cut by now. The lighting was bad, the script was falling apart, and the leading men were about to die. Inside the lunar module Eagle, a spider-like contraption with walls as thin as 3 sheets of aluminum foil, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were not reciting patriotic speeches. They were troubleshooting a crash. At 30,000 feet, diving into the gravity well of an alien world at 3,000 miles per hour. The onboard guidance computer triggered an error code that no one on the ground had trained for. 1,202. Yellow warning lights flashed on the console. The computer had less processing power than a modern musical greeting card. It was overloading. It was trying to calculate velocity and altitude while simultaneously processing radar data it didn't need. It was the 1969 equivalent of the blue screen of death, happening in a vehicle falling out of the sky. "Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm," Armstrong said. His voice was calm, the practiced flatline of a test pilot. But his biomedical sensors told a different story. His heart rate was climbing past 100, then 120, eventually spiking to 150 beats per minute. This is the first piece of evidence in our investigation. And it isn't physics, it's biology. If this were a soundstage in Nevada, as the theories suggest, there is no adrenaline. There is no fear of death. You can do a second take. But the telemetry recording of Armstrong's heart is the biological signature of a man who knows he has about 30 seconds of fuel left before he crashes into a boulder field the size of a Volkswagen dealership. Ground control in Houston shouted, "Go! We're go on that alarm!" They ignored the computer. Armstrong took manual control, flying the lander like a helicopter, skimming over the craters, burning the last drops of propellant. When they finally touched down in the Sea of Tranquility, the contact light illuminated. The engine cut. Silence. Absolute vacuum silence. This wasn't a scripted drama. It was a near disaster. And as we peel back the layers of the moon landing conspiracy, we have to ask ourselves a question. If the US government hired a screenwriter to fake the greatest achievement in human history, why did they write a scene where the heroes almost died because of a software glitch? Before we put the moon rocks under the microscope, we have to look the suspect in the eye. The most compelling argument for the conspiracy theory isn't about shadows or flags, it's about motive. To be a fair investigator, we have to admit a hard truth. In 1969, the United States government had a perfect reason to lie. The context of the era is crucial. It was the height of the Cold War. And America was losing. Vietnam. The war was a meat grinder, consuming American blood and treasure with no end in sight. The streets. American cities were burning. Riots. Assassinations. Protests were tearing the social fabric apart. The space race. The Soviet Union was crushing us. They put the first satellite in orbit. They put the first animal in space. They put the first man in space. They did the first spacewalk. NASA was playing catch-up in a race where second place meant geopolitical irrelevance. Then there was the deadline. President John F. Kennedy had publicly promised back in 1961 that we would land a man on the moon and return him safely before this decade is out. By 1968, NASA was terrified. The technology didn't exist yet. The rockets kept blowing up. The computers were primitive. So here is the bank heist logic of the conspiracy. Imagine you are the Nixon administration. You are facing a deadline you can't meet. In a war, you can't win. Against an enemy who is humiliating you. You have 2 choices. Option A. Risk a public failure. Launch a rocket that might explode on live TV, killing 3 national heroes and handing the Soviets the ultimate propaganda victory. Option B. Fake it. Spend a fraction of the budget to film a flawless landing in a secure hangar. You win the Cold War. You boost national morale. and you bankrupt the Soviets by forcing them to compete with a phantom achievement. It is a seductive theory. It makes sense. It appeals to our cynicism about government, a cynicism that would be validated only a few years later by Watergate. We know the government lies. We know they run covert operations. Why wouldn't they run the ultimate covert op to save the American empire? If the investigation stopped at motive, the skeptics would win. The motive is strong, but in a court of law, motive is not enough. You need means and opportunity. And more importantly, you need an alibi that holds up to cross-examination. The problem with the hoax theory isn't the why, it's the how. To fake the moon landing, you don't just need a camera and a set. You need to fake the physics of a vacuum. You need to fake the geology of an alien world. You need to fake the telemetry data streaming to tracking stations all over the world, including those in Australia and Spain. And most impossibly, you need to keep a secret. The Manhattan Project employed about 130,000 people. It leaked like a sieve. The Soviets had spies inside it within months. The Apollo program employed 400,000 people. We are talking about the seamstresses in Dover, Delaware, who hand-sewed the spacesuits, the machinists in California, who milled the engine nozzles, the mathematicians at MIT who wrote the code, the guys who mixed the fuel. For the hoax to work, the conspiracy couldn't just be Neil, Buzz, and Nixon. It would have to involve thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians, all of whom would have to knowingly build fake hardware, analyze fake data, and process fake rocks, without a single one of them ever getting drunk at a bar and saying, "Hey, you know that rocket we built? It's empty." But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the government pulled off the greatest security operation in history. Let's look at the smoking guns the skeptics point to. Let's look at the film. If you ask anyone why they think the landing was faked, they will almost always point to the flag. It's waving, they say. There is no wind in a vacuum. Therefore, it was filmed in a studio with the AC running. Let's look at the footage again. When Neil and Buzz plant the flag, they are struggling. The lunar soil is hard-packed regolith. They are twisting the pole back and forth to drill it into the ground. Here is the physics. In an atmosphere like Earth, air resistance kills momentum. If you wave a flag and stop, the air grabs the fabric and stops it. In a vacuum, there is no air resistance. Newton's first law rules supreme. An object in motion stays in motion. When the astronauts twist the pole, the momentum travels down the fabric. Because there is no air to dampen that energy, the flag continues to swing like a pendulum long after they let go. It isn't flapping in the breeze. It is rippling from inertia. The smoking gun is actually proof of the vacuum. If it were filmed in a studio, the air in the room would have stopped the flag's motion within seconds. The fact that it keeps moving is the fingerprint of space. Then there is the case of the missing stars. Look at the sky, the skeptic says. It's pitch black. Where are the stars? If you go to space, shouldn't you see millions of stars? This is a misunderstanding of how a camera works. The photos on the moon were taken during the lunar morning. The sun was blazing. The lunar surface is covered in gray dust that reflects sunlight like concrete. The astronauts are wearing bright white suits that reflect sunlight like mirrors. To take a photo of a brightly lit object, you have to set a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. If you set your camera to capture the bright astronauts, the aperture is too small to let in the faint light of distant stars. It is the same reason you don't see stars in a photo taken at a football stadium at night. The stadium lights are too bright. If the astronauts had adjusted their cameras to see the stars, the lunar surface would have been blown out to a blinding white, and Neil Armstrong would have looked like a glowing ghost. The missing stars aren't a mistake. They are correct exposure settings. There is a persistent theory that film director Stanley Kubrick was hired to light the set. People claim the shadows in the photos look wrong. Some shadows aren't parallel. Some objects in shadow are still visible. Here is the irony. It would have been harder to fake the lighting in 1969 than to actually go to the moon. In 1969, studio lighting relied on spotlights. Spotlights diverge, they spread out. The sun is a light source 93 million miles away. Its rays arrive parallel. To simulate the sun on a soundstage, you would need a wall of lasers. Technology that didn't exist. And why can we see Buzz Aldrin even when he is standing in the shadow of the lander? Because the moon is reflective. The sunlight hits the ground and bounces back up. It acts as a massive fill light. Plus there is Earthshine, light reflecting off the Earth, which is 4 times larger in the lunar sky than the moon is in ours, and 50 times brighter. The lighting isn't wrong, it's just alien. You can argue with a photograph. You cannot argue with a laser beam. Before they left the surface, the Apollo 11 crew placed a small panel about the size of a suitcase on the ground. The laser-ranging retroreflector. It is covered in 100 fused silica prisms designed to bounce light back exactly where it came from. For the last 50 years, astronomers at observatories in Texas, Hawaii, and France have been firing high-powered lasers at the landing coordinates. The laser shoots up. It hits the mirror. It bounces back. They measure the return time to calculate the distance to the moon, down to the millimeter. If the landing was a hoax, what is bouncing the laser back? You cannot bounce a laser off a soundstage in Burbank. You cannot bounce it off a dirt pile. There is a piece of man-made hardware sitting in the sea of tranquility right now, doing exactly what NASA said it would do. The astronauts brought back 842 pounds of lunar material. These rocks have been distributed to scientists all over the world. A skeptic might say, they just found weird rocks in Antarctica and pretended they were from the moon. Forensic geology disagrees. Moon rocks have a specific scarring called zap pits. These are microscopic craters formed when tiny dust particles slam into the rock at 50,000 miles per hour. On Earth, the atmosphere burns these particles up before they hit the ground. On the moon, there is no shield. The rocks are peppered with these high-velocity impacts. To fake a zap pit, you would need a particle accelerator capable of firing dust grains at 20 times the speed of a bullet. And you would need to do it billions of times, over hundreds of pounds of rock. It would have been cheaper to build the Saturn V rocket. Finally, we return to the perfect alibi. Who had the most to gain from exposing a fake? The Soviet Union. The Russians were not casual observers. They were tracking the Apollo missions with their own deep space massive radio antennas. They were triangulating the telemetry signals. If the radio signal for Apollo 11 had originated from a transmitter in Nevada, the Soviets would have known immediately. Imagine the propaganda victory. They could have stood up at the UN and presented proof that the Americans were lying. It would have destroyed U.S. credibility for a century. But they didn't. They congratulated NASA. The silence of the Kremlin is the loudest proof we have. They checked the math. They tracked the ship. They knew we went. And they hated it. We have looked at the physics of the flag and the chemistry of the rocks, but the final nail in the coffin of the conspiracy theory isn't scientific. It is sociological. It is the sheer, crushing weight of human nature. To fake the moon landing, you couldn't just hire Stanley Kubrick and a few actors. You had to fake the infrastructure of a moon landing. The Apollo program was not a small covert operation. It was the largest civilian technological mobilization in human history. It employed roughly 400,000 people. It involved 20,000 industrial firms and universities. It involved the seamstresses at ILC Dover in Delaware, who hand-stitched the 21 layers of the spacesuits. It involved the machinists at Rocketdyne in California, who built the F-1 engines. It involved the guidance officers in Houston, the tracking station crews in Australia, and the recovery divers in the Pacific Ocean. Here's the problem with conspiracies. They leak. The Manhattan Project was the most secretive military operation of World War II. It was run under martial law. The penalty for talking was treason. And yet, the Soviet Union had spies inside Los Alamos almost immediately. The Apollo program was 3 times larger than the Manhattan Project. It was a civilian operation, not a military one. There was no martial law. People went home to their families at 5 p.m. For the hoax theory to work, you have to believe that 400,000 people kept the same secret for 50 years. You have to believe that not a single engineer got drunk and bragged. Not a single accountant noticed the billions of dollars going to a movie set instead of aerospace contractors. Skeptics argue only the guys at the top needed to know. This fails the logic test. If the rocket was empty, the fuel guys would know. If the telemetry was fake, the computer guys would know. If the rocks were fake, the geologists would know. The sheer competence required to pull off the hoax exceeds the competence required to go to the moon. So, why does the conspiracy persist? Why do millions of people still believe we never went? The answer is not found in the evidence. It is found in the psychology of the audience. The moon hoax is a symptom of a deeper wound in the American psyche, the loss of faith. In 1969, we believed our institutions could do the impossible. We believed in the future. Today, after Vietnam, Watergate, the Challenger explosion, and decades of political polarization, we have become cynical. We expect our leaders to lie. We expect the news to be fake. Believing the moon landing was a hoax is a defense mechanism. It protects us from the painful realization that we used to be giants. It comforts us by dragging the heroes of the past down to the level of our modern cynicism. If they were liars, then we don't have to feel bad about how small we have become. But the truth doesn't care about our cynicism. The truth is sitting in the sea of tranquility right now. The descent stage of the Eagle is still there, gold foil gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The retroreflectors are still there, bouncing lasers back to Earth, and the footprints are still there. Because there is no wind on the moon, no rain to wash the slate clean. The boot prints Neil Armstrong left in the regolith on July 20th, 1969, are as crisp today as the moment he lifted his foot. They will likely remain there for millions of years, long after the internet arguments have faded, long after the civilization that sent him has turned to dust. We went. We did the impossible. And we left the receipts on the front porch of the universe. This investigation was built on the public telemetry logs of the Apollo guidance computer, the geological assays from the Lunar Sample Laboratory facility in Houston, and the ongoing laser ranging data from the McDonald Observatory in Texas. The case of Apollo 11 is closed, but the story is not over. As we speak, the Artemis program is preparing to return humanity to the lunar surface. This time, we are not going for a flags and footprints mission. We are going to stay. We are going to build a base camp at the lunar South Pole. When the next generation of astronauts steps out of their lander, they will look up and see the Earth hanging in the void, just as Armstrong did. And somewhere across the gray wastes, the silent machines of Apollo will be waiting for them. The ultimate alibi, standing guard over history. The footprints are safe. They are just waiting for company.
Just an echo.